If someone handed you the deed to 190 acres of burned-out forest in northern Ontario and told you it was worthless, that the wildfire had taken everything, that all that was left was scorched Canadian shield rock and the grey skeletons of dead spruce, would you take it? Most people would say no. Most people, faced with a choice between a ruined piece of wilderness and a fresh start somewhere else, would choose the fresh start. And for about 40 minutes on a cold Tuesday morning in February, Natalie Corrigan almost made that choice. The office of Pritchard and Associates in Thunder Bay smelled of old coffee and central heating. Howard Pritchard, 61, had been the Corrigan family's estate solicitor for over 2 decades, and he delivered bad news the same way he delivered good news, with a measured, unhurried calm that made him either very reassuring or deeply maddening, depending on which side of the desk you were sitting on. Natalie, 36, had taken the chair closest to the window. She had driven 4 hours from Sudbury that morning, leaving before sunrise, with a travel mug of instant coffee and a knot in her stomach that hadn't eased since her grandfather Emmett had died 6 weeks earlier. She hadn't been sleeping well. A year ago, the Sudbury School Board had consolidated 3 elementary schools into one, and her position, 7 years teaching grade 4, had been eliminated in the same memo that thanked her for her service. She was 3 months behind on rent. Her car made a sound she had been deliberately ignoring since October. Across the office sat her older brother, Adrian Corrigan, 42. Adrian had driven up from Toronto in a leased SUV. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. He had been checking his phone under the edge of Howard's mahogany desk since they sat down, which told Natalie everything she needed to know about how much he expected this to matter. Howard opened the folder. The registered savings, GI keys, and cash assets, along with the 2019 F-150 and the household contents of the Halcourt residence, are bequeathed to Adrian James Corrigan. He cleared his throat. Timber lot, 190 acres of registered private land in Halcourt Township, Cochrane District, is bequeathed in its entirety to Natalie Jean Corrigan. Adrian looked up from his phone. The burned lot? He said it exactly the way you'd say the broken one. Nat, the wildfire went through there 2 summers ago. I drove past it on the way up to the lake last August. There's nothing left. The Ministry of Natural Resources has it flagged as a fire hazard zone. I know, Natalie said. He left you a liability. Once the spring assessment comes in, you're responsible for slash disposal and fire mitigation compliance. That's not a gift. That's a bill with your name on it. Howard slid a white envelope across the desk toward Natalie. There is one additional matter. A resource company, North Shield Resource Partners, has approached the estate. They've made an offer on the parcel. How much? Adrian asked. $45,000, cash unconditional 30-day close. Adrian exhaled like a man who had just spotted the exit in a crowded room. Natalie, take it. 45 clears your arrears, gets you a working car, and gives you some breathing room. Grandpa Emmett was a wonderful man, but he held onto that land out of stubbornness, not sense. The fire settled the question for him. Natalie stared at the envelope. She hadn't touched it. $45,000. She did the arithmetic the way people in debt always do, automatically, without meaning to. Rent. Car. A few months where she wasn't choosing between groceries and her phone bill. It was rescue money. It was real. But something sat wrong. She thought of the last summer she'd spent at Halcourt, 14 years old, riding on the back of Emmett's ATV along the old logging roads with the boreal forest thick on both sides. Her grandfather had a habit of stopping at random and sitting very still with the engine off, just listening. She used to think he was going a little odd. Now she understood he had been paying attention to something she hadn't learned to hear yet. The shield doesn't give up what it holds, Natalie, he used to say, pressing one hand flat to the outcroppings of grey granite that pushed up through the soil like the bones of something ancient and patient. People look at rock and see nothing, But Rock has been keeping secrets since long before any of us were born. Who is the contact at North Shield? Natalie asked. Howard checked his notes, a Mr. Fletcher Crane, Regional Acquisitions, based out of Timmins. Natalie put the envelope in her coat pocket without opening it. I'll need some time. Adrian made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Don't think too long. Fire-damaged land doesn't appreciate with waiting. It's my land, Adrian, she said quietly. I'll take the time I need. She drove back to Sudbury the same day in the dark, the envelope on the passenger seat still sealed. She did not sleep that night. She spread her old road atlas across the kitchen table. Her phone GPS cut out north of Cochrane, and she'd never gotten around to downloading the offline maps, and found Halcourt Township with her finger. 190 acres. She tried to remember how the property looked from the ridge above the homestead clearing. The way the tree line broke along the granite spine, the old log building her great-great-grandfather Cornelius had built in 1923. The root cellar he'd cut into the base of the hillside with a hand drill, and what her grandfather always said was, a brother's worth of stubbornness. She thought about the fact that Emmett had never once sold. Not when Adrian had floated the idea after the fire, not when the township sent compliance letters. Not even when his own health costs were mounting in the last 2 years, and she had offered to help him with the bills, and he had refused with a patience that had irritated her at the time, and now felt like a message she was only just beginning to decode. Why had he never sold? 2 weeks later, Natalie loaded her hatchback with her camping gear, her rubber boots, a battery lantern, and 6 days' worth of food, and drove north. The Corrigan timber lot looked like the surface of another planet. The wildfire had pushed through from the northwest in a dry August 2 years ago, and it had taken the standing black spruce and birch down to their crowns. What remained was a landscape of silver-grey trunks, some still upright, most tilted or down, with the ground between them covered in a low mat of fireweed and ash moss. The old log homestead was a collapsed heap of charred timber. The stone chimney at its center still stood, though, pointing straight up into the February sky, like something that had simply decided not to fall. Natalie stood at the edge of the access road and looked at it for a long time. Then she pulled her waders on over her jeans and walked in. She spent the first 4 days clearing debris around the homestead foundation, working alone with a pry bar and a hand saw, making herself learn the shape of what was left. The root cellar entrance, set into the south face of the granite outcropping behind the ruins, was buried under a fallen birch trunk as thick as her waist. She spent most of day 3 on it. North Shield called on day 5, Fletcher Crane himself. His voice had the smooth, practiced warmth of someone who had learned to sound patient, even when he wasn't. He was sorry about her grandfather. He understood this must be a difficult time. He simply wanted to make sure she knew the offer remained open, and that North Shield was, of course, completely flexible on her timeline. I'm not in a position to make a decision right now, Natalie said. She was standing inside her tent with a headlamp strapped to her forehead, and her boots still caked with frozen mud. Of course. No pressure at all. A warm pause. I'd love to come up and see the property sometime, if you'd ever be open to that, just to put a face to a name. I'll be in touch, she said, and ended the call. Fletcher called again 11 days later. The offer had increased, 58,000. Then 3 weeks after that, 70,000. Natalie didn't call back. She kept working. She had made camp on the high ground behind the homestead ruins, on a flat shelf of exposed granite that the fire had swept clean. She ran a small solar panel from a south-facing rock and charged her phone and her lantern batteries in the thin winter sun. She ate canned soup and instant oatmeal, and one memorable evening, a box of Kraft dinner she cooked on her camp stove while the temperature dropped to -16. And she sat in her sleeping bag to eat it. She had stopped thinking about Sudbury. She had stopped thinking about the rent and the school board and the car sound she was ignoring. All she thought about, in those narrow, cold February days, was the land. It was coming back. She could see it in real time, the way you can in boreal country after a fire. The fireweed already pushing up in the sheltered spots, the first aspen suckers breaking through frost-cracked soil, the chickadees and whiskey jacks reappearing as though they'd simply been waiting for someone to notice them. Underneath it all, the Canadian shield, the same granite that had been here when the last glacier retreated 12,000 years ago, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened on its surface in the time since. She pressed her palm flat to it one evening, the cold biting into her skin, and felt exactly nothing and everything. On the 31st day, she finished clearing the birch trunk from the root cellar entrance. The old plank door had a hasp and padlock. The padlock was seized solid with rust and ice. She worked at it for 40 minutes with penetrating oil and a cold chisel before it finally surrendered, pulling an anchor bolt out of the rotting wood entirely, and the door swung outward on one hinge and released a gust of air so cold and so completely still that it felt genuinely preserved, like something that had been held exactly as it was, waiting. She clicked on her headlamp and ducked inside. The cellar was small, maybe 4 meters by 5, lined with rough-dressed granite on 3 sides, the fourth being the solid rock of the hillside itself. The remains of old wooden shelving had mostly collapsed along the walls. A few glass-preserving jars stood on a low ledge, their contents long since turned to mold, and in the far corner, almost invisible under the debris of collapsed shelving and 40 years of accumulated dust, was a flat-topped steamer trunk, metal, painted green once. The hinges were solid. Natalie dragged it clear and tried the latches. Locked, she went back to camp for her pry bar. It took less than a minute. Under a folded wool blanket that fell to dust at the touch were 2 things. The first was a metal document box. Inside it were papers, folded and yellowed and fragile as dried leaves. She opened the first one with the careful attention of someone who already sensed it mattered. It was a timber license, issued by the Crown of Ontario, Lands Branch, dated April 14th, 1923. Granted to Cornelius James Corrigan for the management and harvesting of timber resources on the described parcel, the exact same 190 acres she was standing underneath. Perpetual license, renewable in perpetuity upon continued private ownership. Natalie sat back on her heels on the cold stone floor and stared at it under the headlamp for a long time. She was not a lawyer. She did not know in that moment exactly what she was looking at. But she knew that her grandfather had never sold this land. She knew that North Shield had started calling the week after Emmett died and had been raising their number every time she didn't answer. She knew that Fletcher Crane had offered $70,000 for a piece of fire-damaged wilderness in February, in person, with increasing urgency. And she knew that Emmett had pressed his palm to this rock and told her it was keeping secrets. The second item in the trunk was a cotton drawstring sack. The cord came apart in her fingers. Inside were coins, dozens of them, stamped with the profile of British monarchs across 6 decades. Victoria to George V, British gold sovereigns, her great-grandfather's savings, accumulated through the 1920s, and sealed into this hillside when the banks failed, and the Depression arrived, and cash became unreliable, and gold did not. Natalie closed her hand around one of them. It was heavier than it looked. She was still sitting on the floor of the root cellar, the document box open across her knees, when she heard tires on the frozen gravel of the access road. She switched off the headlamp. Through the gap at the top of the cellar door, she could see the front corner of a black pickup truck she did not recognize. A man in a red down jacket stepped out and stood looking at her hatchback with a kind of professional assessment that had nothing to do with casual curiosity. Natalie closed the trunk. She latched the cellar door behind her and came around from the side of the building so Fletcher would not see where she had come from. Fletcher Crane, 48, had an open, reasonable face and the easy posture of a man who had spent a career working in the north and knew how to seem unthreatening in remote locations. He was good at seeming unthreatening. He had been doing it a long time. "Mrs. Corrigan?" He turned toward her, saw a smile that arrived a half-second before his eyes caught up with it. "I apologize for showing up unannounced. I was in the area and took a chance. I hope you don't mind." He looked around at the burned lot with the practiced sympathy of someone who had already calculated its value to the dollar. "I'm authorized to come to you today with a substantially revised offer. $115,000, no conditions, no environmental assessment required on your end." Natalie looked at him. "Why does North Shield want this parcel, Fletcher?" "Carbon credit potential. Recovering boreal is an increasingly significant asset under the federal framework." "You've been on this property," she said. She watched his face. It did not move. But something behind his eyes went very still. "The access road has been used within the past 2 years. There are tread marks under the fire debris on the east ridge. Someone cleared the brush from the resource survey markers on the north boundary last summer. That work wasn't done by the Crown. The ministry hasn't been on this property in 3 years. It was done by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for." The warmth in Fletcher's expression dropped by a degree. "Any survey activity would have been standard due diligence on an adjacent parcel. The adjacent parcel is Crown land. This is not." She held his gaze. "My grandfather never sold this land, not once in 60 years of people asking. And you drove up here in February with a number that went from 45,000 to 115 in 6 weeks. That's not carbon credits. You already know what's here." The smile disappeared completely. Whatever professional warmth had been in his voice went with it. "You're making an error," Fletcher said. "The ministry is going to issue a compliance order for slash disposal and fire mitigation on this lot within 60 days. That's a minimum $30,000 remediation bill. You can't cover it. And you can't do anything productive with this land without capital you don't have. When you default, and you will be positioned to acquire the tax lien for considerably less than I'm offering you now." He let that sit for a moment. "Take the 115, drive home, start over." "I think you should leave," Natalie said. Fletcher looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he walked back to his truck, reversed off the access road without hurrying, and was gone. Natalie went back into the root cellar. She sat on the cold stone floor in the dark and held the 1923 timber license in both hands, and thought about her grandfather standing in this exact spot in all the years he had lived with this knowledge, and she thought about why he had chosen her. He had known she was the only one stubborn enough to stay. She took photographs of every document in the box using her phone and spent 20 agonizing minutes on 1 bar of signal uploading them to her email. Then she sent them with a subject line that said simply, "Urgent, timber license question, please advise." The recipient was Suzanne Bellamy, a property and resource rights lawyer in Thunder Bay, whose name she had gotten from her university roommate's cousin, who had dealt with a precedent issue on a private lot near Kapuskasing 4 years earlier. Suzanne Bellamy, 52, called back in under 4 hours. She had a voice that sounded as though it had argued against large resource companies before, and had won those arguments cleanly and without sentiment. "Where are you right now?" Suzanne asked. "On my land." A brief pause. "Good, stay there. Don't sign anything, and don't allow anyone onto that property without written notice and my contact information." What followed was an explanation that Natalie listened to very carefully, sitting cross-legged in her tent with a notepad on her knee. Ontario's forestry legislation had been substantially revised multiple times since 1923. Much of the original private license framework had been superseded. But the specific clause of the Corrigan license, perpetual, tied to unbroken private ownership of the described parcel, had never been formally extinguished. Emmett had maintained continuous private ownership. The land had never reverted to the Crown. Under a 1978 provincial amendment that had been the subject of exactly 2 legal precedents since it was passed, a license of this type remained valid. North Shield had known this for 3 years, They had been waiting for Emmett to die. "What does valid actually mean in practical terms?" Natalie asked. "It means," Suzanne said carefully, "that you hold a perpetual Crown-issued right to manage and harvest timber on this property. Under the current federal biodiversity and carbon credit framework, 190 acres of recovering boreal forest with a valid historical license is a significant asset. I need to complete a proper valuation assessment." A pause. "But you are not looking at $45,000, Natalie. You are looking at something considerably larger than that." The RCMP attended Halcourt Township on a Thursday in April. Natalie had filed a formal complaint regarding unauthorized trespass and unlicensed resource surveying on private land. Fletcher Crane had no criminal record, but North Shield Resource Partners, under investigation, turned out to have filed a fraudulent boundary declaration on an adjacent Crown parcel 3 years prior, using survey data that could only have come from unauthorized work on the Corrigan timber lot. The company was charged under Ontario's Public Lands Act. Fletcher was named personally in the civil proceeding. None of what followed was fast. It stretched across 9 months of correspondence, filings, a provincial offences hearing, and a separate civil suit. Natalie drove to Thunder Bay more times than she counted. She lived in her tent on the granite shelf until May, then in a rented camper trailer on the homestead clearing, paid for with the first of the gold sovereigns she took to an appraiser in Cochrane. The coins, 44 British sovereigns ranging from 1891 to 1929, all in remarkable condition for having spent 90 years in a granite hillside, appraised at just over $62,000. It covered her back rent. It covered the remediation assessment, which came in under $20,000 once a proper evaluation was done. It covered Suzanne's retainer and left enough for her to stop worrying about the car sound for the first time in a year. The timber license took longer. In the end, the province of Ontario confirmed the license's validity rather than risk a precedent-setting challenge in provincial court. North Shield settled the civil complaint for an amount Natalie was not permitted to disclose publicly, but it was, combined with the formal carbon and biodiversity credit valuation on the recovering 190 acres, enough to make her financially secure in a way she had never been in her adult life. After Suzanne's fees and all associated costs, Natalie Corrigan walked away with $4.3 million and still owned the land. She kept the land. The following spring, she contracted a builder from Cochrane to pour a proper foundation for a cabin on the high granite shelf where she had camped through the winter. She hired a registered boreal forester to begin a long-term timber management and restoration plan. She did not try to make the land what it had been before the fire. She tried to help it become what it was already becoming on its own terms. The stone chimney from the old homestead she kept standing. She had a stonemason repoint the mortar and set a flat piece of shield granite at its base as a marker, the same grey Canadian shield rock her grandfather had pressed his palm to and asked her to listen. She was on the cabin porch on a Sunday morning in late September, holding her coffee with both hands, watching a ruffed grouse move through the young aspen below the ridge, when she heard a rental car coming up the access road. She recognized the engine note before she saw the car. Adrian had aged somewhat since February. The drive up from the Cochrane Highway exit had clearly been longer than he remembered. He stepped out and looked at the cabin, the gravel track, the orderly rows of seedling spruce along the north boundary, with an expression that moved between something that wanted to be admiration and something that couldn't quite let go of the old math he'd done in Howard Pritchard's office. "Nat," he tried a smile, "this is remarkable. You've really done something here." "Hello, Adrian." He came up the porch steps slowly, his hands in his jacket pockets. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed a conversation on the drive and was now finding the terrain slightly different from how he'd imagined it. "Listen, I know things were tense at the solicitor's office. I was dismissive and I wasn't being fair to you." He paused. "The thing is, The Toronto market has been genuinely difficult this year. I have some bridge financing coming due, and since the original estate, the total value of Grandpa Emmett's assets, arguably the equitable intent of the bequest. It didn't, Natalie said. Adrian stopped. The estate was clear. Howard read it clearly. She looked at her brother evenly, without anger, without warmth. You received the savings, the GCs, the truck, and everything in the house. I received this land. She set her coffee mug on the porch railing. I didn't ask you to split the $62,000. I didn't ask you for anything when I was sleeping in a tent at -16 and filing trespass complaints by 1 bar of signal. I didn't call you when Fletcher Crane showed up here with $115,000 in a briefcase and told me I'd lose it all to the tax lien. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Natalie walked down off the porch to the stone chimney. She pressed her palm flat against the granite slab at its base. It was cold and solid and completely indifferent, the same as it had always been, the same as it would be long after both of them were entirely gone. Emmett left this land to me because he believed I was the only one who would stay, she said. Not because I was smarter than you, not because I was more deserving. Because I was the one who would stay when staying was hard. She lifted her hand from the stone. You have a long drive back to the highway. The Cochrane Road isn't great after dark. She watched the rental car back out and disappear down the track, and then she stood still for a moment in the September quiet, listening to the wind moving through the young aspen on the slope. The fireweed had gone to seed. The seed heads drifted past her on the air, white and weightless, catching the afternoon light. Below her, 190 acres of recovering boreal forest stretched south toward the tree line, alive and getting more alive with every season that passed. The shield had kept what was worth keeping. It always had. It always would. Would you have walked away from that burned-out lot if your own family told you it was worthless? If the offer was real and the relief was immediate and every sensible voice in the room said, take it? Natalie almost did. If her story kept you watching until the very end, leave us a comment below. We read everyone. And if you believe that holding on to what's yours is always worth it, hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories about ordinary people who held on when everyone else told them to let go.